Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wond'ry Social Innovation Monthly Speaker Series. My name is Jacqueline Matupi with the Social Innovation team. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if not, welcome back. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. For those not familiar with the Wond'ry Innovation Center, we offer state-of-the-art makerspace, virtual reality labs, workshops, training opportunities, and programs designed to support anyone from budding entrepreneurs to community change makers. The Wond'ry welcomes participants from all backgrounds, disciplines, and abilities, empowering them to develop innovative and creative solutions that change the world. Today, I am thrilled to be talking with Samantha Vade, Associate Director with Forum for the Future. Forum is a leading international sustainability nonprofit with offices in London, New York, Singapore, and Mumbai. For over 24 years, Forum has been working in partnership with businesses, governments, and civil society to accelerate transformation towards a just and a regenerative future. Samantha's work at Forum focuses on the business sector, working with them to stretch their visions and set future fit, ambitious sustainability strategies that go beyond risk mitigation and dare to be part of work that contributes to the full restoration of our planet, both ecologically and socially. Most recently, she was part of a team working on a 9-month inquiry to explore what it actually means for business to go beyond sustainability and begin to adopt regenerative mindsets. In partnership with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development and with input from the American Sustainable Business Council and leading businesses, including Unilever, Nestle, IKEA, General Mills, Kimberly-Clark, Seventh Generation, SIG, and Capgemini, this team has explored how to move the guiding star of our sustainability efforts from risk mitigation or even net zero to commitments that are to commitment to the fundamental repair of the damage done to living systems and a complete reorientation of the goals of the system. The team just published the first output of its work, named A Compass for a Just and Regenerative Future, in November of 2021. Prior to joining Forum for the Future, Samantha spent 20+ years working in the coffee sector, in innovation, corporate sustainability, and learning and development. She is delightfully happy to call Lancaster, Pennsylvania home with her husband, with her partner and beloved mutt, and spends too much time on Amtrak, heading to the Forum offices in Brooklyn. She's happy to talk to anyone about dogs, coffee, British mystery novels, and of course, saving the planet. Samantha, a very, very warm welcome to you. Your bio is inspiring and amazing. Just thrilled and genuinely honored to spend this hour with you, talking about everything I just mentioned. But wanted to ask, is there anything that I didn't include, or why are you in this work? The bio is very much what, but would be so curious to learn the why behind the what.
Great. Thank you, Jacqueline. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this. Hearing your own bio read aloud is one of the most awkward things out there, along with maybe an annual performance review and writing a resume. So thank you for that awkward moment to kick off today. Glad to be here. I'm glad to see some folks I know in the participant list and many folks I don't know. So yeah, I guess a little context as to why I have found this current kind of work that I've had the honor and privilege to be involved in at Forum so inspiring is, you know, I'll start a little bit with my background and how it's led me to this. But yeah, my educational background was in psychology and organizational communication. I took a feminist study course my senior year in college, and I think there are probably a lot of folks on this call that can relate to something, you know, in your early 20s that was maybe kind of marked a significant change in your life. And that course was definitely one of those things for me. It was the first chance, I think, where I had to study systems, though we didn't call it systems. But at Forum for the Future, which is a systems change organization, I often talk about this as kind of my origin story of understanding systems. And the looking at kind of systemic inequalities through a primary lens of gender was the first chance I kind of, first opportunity I had to say like, oh, there's systems that are working here that are often unseen and that are creating some wonderful things in our society, but also kind of environmental degradation and systemic inequality. Anyway, while I was doing all this work, I went on and did my master's in feminist studies, and all this time was paying my bills by being a barista. And through doing that, I fell in love with the coffee industry. I still am deeply in love with the coffee industry. I often tell people that my husband, when we got married, I didn't ask for forever till death do us part. I asked him to make me coffee every morning as our vow, literally. And I don't know what that says about me or maybe about my love of coffee, but anyway, so I was swimming in this feminist studies, kind of org design, psychology, coffee, and worked in business for like 20 years. And then about 4 years ago was kind of disenchanted with some of the own work I was doing. And a position came open at Forum. And for those who might know Forum, I was actually just cheekily delighted by the sheer audacity of Forum's ambition. I was a little sick of making business cases for sustainability and kind of felt that Forum's charge to really challenge businesses. And I'll be honest, we do it well sometimes, and there are times we don't, you know, like any ambition, but joined Forum. And this past year, as you said, we have been investigating this idea of regenerative. So we've reset our vision from working towards a sustainable future to a just and regenerative future. And there's a lot of really interesting thinking about that I think regenerative might help us reset some of our mindsets to actually get us to the change that we need. I'm hoping it doesn't just become another buzzword. So yeah, so excited to share some of what I think this new to some of us, for many Indigenous communities, it's more of a returning to, but what I think this thinking might be able to offer us as leaders on this call.
Great, thank you for that. I too am an avid coffee drinker. Didn't make it into my wedding vows, but I
cool. I'm telling you, having someone make you coffee every morning is a sheer delight. So anyway,
game changer. I will say, having read the reports that you guys recently authored, I was really struck by the thought leadership that Forum brings to the discourse on leadership and how to get beyond just net zero. So onto the recent article you wrote, which is a truly thought-provoking piece, and it talks about the need for a new type of leadership, one that's just and regenerative. And the trend for regenerative practices I have seen on the rise as it relates to agriculture and the built environment, but I haven't seen that translate in the leadership space, but I think it's so applicable, particularly with COVID in the last 2 years, navigating the new state of business. And it does require a new type of leader, one stylistically leading people and then operationally leading supply chains. And so for those that aren't steeped in sustainability speak, can you tell us in your own words what just regenerative leadership is? I did take an excerpt from your article and put it in the chat just for reference. And I think it's really important, kind of level set vocabulary, so we're all talking from the same place. And if you do have any questions, please, folks, those tuning in, just put it in the chat and we will read those as we unpack these 5 principles.
Great, Jacqueline. I'm going to quickly, as we talked about, just share my screen. So can you see that? What I have in front of you, it should be. Can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Okay. Again, let me know. I'm going to go off video while I'm just sharing the screen because my Wi-Fi might not tolerate video, audio, and the screen. But okay, so what do we mean? What is Forum beginning to think about in terms of the definition for just and regenerative leadership? I think the way that we're framing this is really in 2 ways. So one is that to embrace a just and regenerative approach to leadership, I think first is beginning to understand what would it truly mean to apply this thinking to what we've traditionally called sustainability work. So one is just the work that I think it it requires to kind of understand this concept and not turn it into another buzzword, right? So simply replacing what we've always said is sustainability and now calling it regenerative. And so I want to talk about what that is, but then I think there's some work to do to actually kind of shift how we approach the practice of leadership. But what you see on the screen here is kind of how we are thinking about regenerative and a regenerative approach to sustainability. So depending on how long you've been in the sustainability sector or in the sustainability work, if you have worked in this arena, you might recognize this. I know when I started my career in this arena, we were really still talking about minimizing negative impacts or doing less harm, right? So these were regulation based often, or we were setting targets around reduction. So reducing your carbon footprint, reducing your water use, which was good, but it's still doing less bad is still bad, right? You see sustainability 2.0, we kind of think of as heading to zero or no harm neutrality. Which again is good, but still probably not quite right. And then we've seen in the last couple of years a net positive approach really emerging. And this is really great. It's not to say that any of these are bad per se, but it's just thinking about like, where do we really want to set the full ambition, the guiding star? And the challenge with net positive is this putting back still implies that you've taken out at some point. You know, you've gone into a deficit and then we have to replenish. It is not sustainable in the original meaning of the word. And then there's this regenerative exploration. And yes, a lot of this comes from regenerative agriculture, but people are trying to apply this in other ways. And it's the idea of actually reconfiguring systems so that they are able to thrive and continue to evolve on their own without constant intervention. And that is what we're seeing as kind of the new leading edge of sustainability. So that's what I would say is leading in sustainability. If you're beginning to think it kind of the sustainability 4.0. Now, the definition that we've been using is that a just and regenerative approach, whether you're talking about sustainability or whether you're talking about a leadership, is that it fundamentally is about respecting the potential and the right of all living systems to thrive. And I think what's interesting here is the idea of potential, that everything has the potential, and the right, that people have a right to not just survive, which I think a lot of our sustainability work is on, trying to eliminate the worst types of poverty or trying to get to a minimum wage or a living wage, but actually how do we rewrite the system so that people thrive? And when we say living systems, that's everything from a community to an office to an individual body. So that is kind of the fundamental definition we're using for a regenerative and just approach to leadership.
That's great. Thank you. I'm a very visual learner. So the 4.0, I think I've been working on this maybe a decade plus. I think we were maybe at 2.0 at that time. And so to watch the evolution, I'm sure we'll have to get to 7.0 to really be able to move the needle. But thank you for that explanation. I think it's helpful just to level set the conversation. Also, you kick off your article talking about how some of our well-intentioned corporate sustainability work has actually propped up unsustainable systems by distracting us from incremental changes. So in other words, that the intent is not aligned with the impact. Can you speak to that more and how that kind of sets the stage for today's conversation?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to say like that. I think most folks are trying to do good work, right? So this doesn't mean that I think the work that I contributed to, or potentially other folks on the call, we weren't trying to do the best work we can. And I do think there's a time to deal with the crisis of the situation. And then there's times to deal with the chronic nature of it. And I think, unfortunately, there was a lot of what we have done in corporate sustainability that is all about Band-Aid solutions or solutions that are dealing with kind of around the fringes, around the edges, versus fundamentally rewriting the systems. And I think some of the ways this shows up, and is in tokenism versus fundamental change. So we see this kind of in token programs or things that organizations might do that feel good, but when you kind of scratch beneath the surface, they're not really solving the fundamental issues. And you've probably all heard this if you're involved in systems change, but the system gets what it's designed to get, right? So until we rewrite the system, we're going to continue to see the same outputs. And I guess to make that example maybe a little more concrete, I think if we think of a business where the sustainability department is a separate department, often with an anemic budget, probably under-resourced, and that sustainability department is often tasked with solving the very ills that potentially the procurement practices or the fundamental business model is creating, right? So the example that I use just from the coffee industry, since that's what I'm most familiar with, is, potentially we're not changing the very fundamental ways that we're buying coffee and the value, how we're distributing that value down the value chain. And then we ask our sustainability teams with their paltry budgets to fix food insecurity, to fix lack of resilience in these communities. And it's makes us feel good, but we're not fixing the fundamental issue. And it's just a weird way to circulate money around the system. It's just not a good use of funds, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, and it's more about this putting back in versus taking less and fundamentally reconfiguring the system from the front end. Anyway, so that's what I mean when I think sometimes our corporate sustainability work is more about doing less bad than really trying to fix the problems that we all see. And I think most of us really want to try to solve.
Great, that's helpful and very much sets the stage for kind of springboarding into the 5 principles to remedy that or address that. Can you speak to how a leader can adopt a more just and regenerative mindset in their daily practice, and moreover in the office culture itself? It's so hard to set that culture and right that ship. Your article touches on 5 principles. So I'd love to start kind of with the first principle, and if there's any questions as we go, I can read them aloud. But the first principle is focus on the how, not just the what.
Yeah, so a regenerative and just approach, or even kind of a living systems approach, recognizes that the how gets fundamentally baked into the what. So that if you are trying to aim for programs in your organization that yield social justice, but your own organization is functioning in a way that is propping up current unsustainable practices, I just don't think those two things, I don't think it works, right? And I guess the example that I've been using that seems to resonate with folks is, we're seeing this move in this decade of delivery to making unsustainable sectors more sustainable. So for example, we're seeing a fair amount of work go into changing fossil fuel dependent energy systems to renewable energy systems. I think what we want, what we hope with a just and regenerative approach is that we are thinking about the way that we're doing this so that we don't end up to a place where maybe we've shifted systems to renewable energy, but we've done this in a way that has created more human rights abuses in renewable energy supply chains. We know that that's a fairly, that's a big challenge in renewable energy technology supply chains. Or, where I'm located, there's a lot of coal communities. And so if we do all this work and we've left whole swaths of people behind, that is also not getting us to where we want to be. So there's something about figuring out how are we not just doing these transitions, but we're doing them in a just fashion. Yeah, and I guess from a leadership standpoint, I think a lot of us on this call, I know I grew up in leadership that was very traditional. So it's all about results, not effort. I remember being told a lot of times in stern voices that I needed to act more professionally. And anyway, I guess there's something about kind of recognizing that how do we enable as leaders in any organization, but how are we fostering not just what the work that people are doing, but how they're doing it? You know, are they doing it in a way that encourages well-being and care and love? You know, I'm bringing up the word love. I think we need to talk about that more, even in business, which I know is a bit strange for some. But so focusing on not just the what, but the how.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that principle really resonates with me because I think it really challenges the business practices I've learned and leaned on in my career, that the end justifies the means, right? And that results trump process. But indeed, it doesn't. So the how does need to get baked into the what. So moving on to the next principle, which is principle 2, start with potential, not the problem. And I'm a big believer of operating from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. So would love for you to speak more on that.
Yeah, and just one more thing on the last, I think the how, not the what. I just want to name one other thing that I think we all are probably trapped in is there's a lot of like sense of urgency, which I think makes us very frenetic. And I think it's often an excuse to not do the how quite right, you know, because we just have to get to the what. And I all these things I'm talking about, I know I perpetuate sometimes, and but I think this idea of slowing down to go fast, it's just something about thinking about like, how do you this old slow down to go fast, I think is part of that how, not just the what. Okay, yeah, so potential, not problems. Yes, I mean, I think this is exactly about what you said, Jacqueline, this idea of abundance and starting from a place of potential and opportunity versus problems. We still do this at Forum, and we're talking about this. Those of you out there might start a concept note with the problem we're trying to solve. And yes, that might help focus limited resources, et cetera, but it definitely kind of shuts things down. And it starts from a place of scarcity, as opposed to thinking about what is the potential in the situation, not the problem we're trying to solve. I think it offers the potential to potentially leapfrog things too, because if you're always just trying to solve a problem, in some ways you're a little behind the 8 ball, right? Whereas if you're saying like, what's the potential? You know, how are we thinking about what is the potential for our business, for our organization, for my family, for my kid in 15 years? It just allows such a more generative, open, and innovative approach to solving some of the issues, some of the challenges that we see in front of us. And I think this is true for individuals. How do we start with their potential and create the soil in which those folks can thrive, as opposed to trying to manage people to some sort of standard that we know that no one will meet. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how well we do this with kids, hopefully, how well we do this with kids. I know, I definitely try to do this with my children, and I just wish we'd bring that to more other places, right? The potential of other living systems. Yeah, so potential, not problems.
That's great. It's a lot more hopeful space to operate in rather than the problem. So moving on to principle 3, care for the operating context. And this one really spoke to the notion that systems are nested, which I think is an important point to underscore if we're going to make systems change. Can you explain this one a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the essence of this one that we tried to capture in this work was this: nobody's an island, So if you are an individual in an organization, you're an individual nested in a team, nested in a larger organization, nested in the business sector, nested in the world. And so we need to be thinking about how the work that we do reflects and creates kind of the larger potential. We also, I think, true leadership in the sustainability space is taking responsibility beyond your four walls. So I guess, the one thing I would say is for those of us that are in sustainability spaces or just as business leaders in general, how are you thinking about not just the work within your four walls, but how are you kind of changing the dialogue in the sector? How are you helping kind of drive a different approach to business? Are you deeply concerned about competition, or are you trying to link arms across the aisle to figure out, how do we share resources to actually change things? And one of the examples we often use here, again, is with science-based targets. So anyone on the call who's involved in sustainability, science-based targets have gotten really popular, which is the idea that if I have a business, I am setting my carbon reduction targets based on what I put out there in the world. And they can be very ambitious. They can be very difficult. But the problem is unless everybody plays ball, we're still going to end up in a deficit. And we're not going to reach the decarbonization that we need to deal with this climate crisis. And so there's something about recognizing if you really want to be a leader in this space, you need to work not just within your own four walls, but think about how am I advocating for and modeling societal decarbonization. And then the final thing I'll say is, I think one of the interesting ones about this, you brought this up on the front end, Jacqueline, is this idea, I think sometimes, and we come across this with a lot of businesses, where they think they can do the work out there. We're going to do sustainability work out there. We're going to deal with white supremacy and racism. We're going to deal with broken supply chains, but we're maybe not looking within our four walls at how are we doing decision making in our organization? How are we thinking about equality? And your organization will always be a fractal of the whole, right? You will always, whatever you do in your organization, whatever you do at a small scale, you will be at a large scale, right? So just thinking about, I'm not always convinced. Sometimes when we do sustainability work with organizations, I want to say, let's start internally. Let's start with how you're organizing your teams and how you make decisions and the words that you use. And then we can move externally. So obviously not that simple, but
it starts by looking in the mirror first, right?
Yeah.
Well said. All right, moving on to principle 4, which is value history and lived experience. And I think that's a timely topic as we reflect on Black History Month, and that proximity to an experience, no matter how close, is still very much different than the lived experience. So can you speak to how this could play out in a leadership role?
Yes, so I think this is about, as you said, valuing each individual person's lived experience and different ways of knowing. So knowing not maybe just through school, but knowing through your own experience, knowing through your body, knowing through stories that you've heard, knowing because of generational wisdom that's been passed down. And I think the other key component of this is specificity, not generalities. And this is one that I will admit as someone who loves efficiencies and has been grappling with a little bit. But I was on a call earlier this week, and someone was talking about like the idea of best practices, and that the problem with best practices is you're simply finding kind of the mean of something, the median. There's no edge in it. And so you have to kind of dilute everything to get to kind of some best practices. And in that dilution, you get this, she called it the great genericizing of our work, right? And the recognition that whether you're dealing with trying to deal with some programs for a coffee community in Guatemala versus Kenya, or you're trying to deal with employee A versus employee B, trying to generic approaches doesn't work. So how do you kind of go in to say, how do we work with you as an individual, your lived experience, and find out what do you uniquely need to thrive? So going back to this potential to thrive. Yes, so it's about kind of, I think, trying to combat this great genericization. I think I made that word up, but you know what I'm saying.
100%. And you hit it on the nail. I've always grappled with best practices, and you just articulated it to perfection as to why I do grapple with it, because it does it. Dilutes.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard people say, but we don't have time for that. The whole thing is best practices save time. And I'm not sure, like all the work we do to kind of find best practices, distill them, share them, scale them, is that any more time than if you were to show up, less prep, more presence, if you were to show up in a community and say, how do we show up in a way and find out what you uniquely need? It actually could be a more efficient use of time, than how do we collect all these best practices and then try to apply them to you.
Efficient and effective. Yeah. Amen. So the last, fifth principle, radically embrace a participatory approach. And I'm here all day for this one. I think you truly saved the best for last. Here you state to recognize the potential of leadership for leadership outside of titles. That's such a powerful statement. And you go on to challenge how we perceive people by their societal titles. So a farmer versus a producer, which I think is a very valid point. Can you speak to that, kind of this last principle, and then how you kind of tie those five together in lockstep together?
Yes. So the last principle, as you said, is radically embrace participatory approaches. Or I guess it should probably be embrace radically participatory approaches. But yes, I think there's a lot of wonderful phrases to think about under this principle. So, one is about, are you working? This is often when we're looking at businesses, and someone just put in the chat, we do work with nonprofit, government sectors, business. I'm talking mostly about business because that was the thrust of this this report that we recently put out, but would love to have a conversation at some point about how this does or doesn't apply across sectors. But I think, oh no, Jacqueline, where was I? So oftentimes when we're working with organizations trying to look at, do we think the work that they're doing in their value chains is the most ambitious it could be? The difference between consultation and collaboration, right? So like, are you actually just consulting, doing a survey, or versus true collaboration? So collaboratively trying to work on a project. Many folks on this call have probably also heard a lot about kind of prior, free and informed consent. But, I think a lot of us think wherever we work, people want us there, but ensuring that where you're going to work and the work that you're going to do is something that that community or that individual actually wants and is coming to the table fully free and open. This is one of those things in organizations when we talk to them about trying to change their own internal practices, kind of trying to consider who decides, and then who decides who decides. I mean, that's where I think you really know where the power is. And how are you working, not just to blow up, all kinds of power. There's all kinds of power. Power can be good. But if you're trying to work with communities that where we're not recognizing their power and you're reifying the way decisions have always been made, I'd question if it's truly participatory. Yeah, and then I think this thing about challenging leadership, attached to titles. I think I put this in this article. I was at this big conference and there were these young folk on stage. They're all like 20. And all of them called out all of us in the room who were my age, probably about my age, like late 30s to early 50s. And they kind of said, like, we're so done with you all. Like we like the models that have always inspired you don't inspire us any longer. And this one kid, look, I'm showing my age there, but this one young man said in particular, we're not really concerned with leadership. Like, I don't want big titles. I don't want, we're more concerned with listening and learning than leadership. And, ironically, I thought, well, that's actually a form of leadership, to show up and truly listen and learn. I'm rambling here, Jacqueline, but the last thing I'll say is I think what this one is fundamentally about is, yes, it's about consent, but it's also about trying to figure out how do we relate to each other more as human to human. Mm-hmm. Trying to get away from titles a little bit, as I say in the article. If I would love to, maybe some of you on this call, I'll see you and we can have a cup of coffee or some whiskey and talk about, like, seriously, what might we gain if we stopped talking about consumers and started talking about fellow citizens and how we're meeting their needs. So consumer versus citizen, or producer. As someone who worked in the coffee sector, I was a little uncomfortable with, like, coffee producers. It's such a reductionist term. Mm-hmm. We're trying to think it form, like, how might we reframe farming as the folks in the communities that steward our land, that one of the most precious, I wouldn't even say a resource, which turns it into some sort of commodity, but one of the most precious enablers of our future. So again, a little rambly here, but I think it's about consent. I think it's about really trying to think about relating to people from a human to human perspective, not really caught up in titles. And I think there's a little bit about, not for me, without me, just ensuring that we're getting the right people in the room.
Yeah, all great points and well said. I love your statement, who gets to decide, and then who decides who decides. And I appreciate the quote, sharing space, but not sharing power is tokenism. And so who gets to decide? And I think oftentimes consulting does get conflated with co-creating and collaborating, but making sure that it's truly a co-creation. So segueing, so I love those 5 principles, and I'm really gonna try to weave them into my daily practices. And so moving from those principles to kind of the 2 reports you guys just authored, which was a summation of this 9-month inquiry. Would love to learn more about that. But from those reports, the framework of the report is how these business practice principles can be put into motion. Can you share how the reports kind of came to be, the partners involved, and where it stands now? I think in the bio that I read, I had named the partners, but just so curious how that came to be, and what you hope, how do you hope that report is used by business leaders?
Yeah, and I guess one of the things I should have probably said from the front end, Jacqueline, and is there are a lot of folks out there doing really great work in this space. So, and Forum is just one of those groups. I'm just one of these people, very nascent in my journey. So, hoping to share here a little bit about what we are putting forth as our first kind of our first stage of our thinking, but certainly no expertise here. So what the program was meant to do this past year, as you said, it was a group of businesses that Forum engaged along with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. I always have to think through that acronym. To explore what might it take to set out a compass. So not just principles, but ways that businesses might be able to actually experiment with new ways of doing their work. What we would like, I think now, is we put this out there as, we know it's not perfect, right? So we're expecting a lot of hopefully wonderful dynamic feedback this year. And what we'd eventually like to get to is where we have kind of a set of principles or a set of, you're doing well if, for different sustainability challenges, so climate change, human rights, but then also, and this is what I find interesting, different functions within a business. So if you are a marketing team, what does it mean to act from a place of being regenerative and just? If you're a human resources team, if you're a procurement team. And so the goal this year is to kind of test the compass, refine it, kick the tires on it, and then hopefully get to a place where we actually have toolkits, if you will, though toolkit is also like a best practice. So, but that we can bring to businesses to say, okay, are you willing to try this? Are you willing to try to kind of rewire your marketing department with a just and regenerative lens? And let's see what works and what doesn't work. So yes, so that's the hope this year. And I have no doubt it's going to be very difficult. I mean, because every business is within the system, that rewards people who get in line.
Yeah.
And,
What was your biggest surprise? You had this 9-month inquiry. What were the biggest surprises from that exercise?
Yeah, I love this question. When I was looking at your questions, this is the one that I had to think about a bit. And I would say, and it'd be interesting to hear folks on the call if they're feeling this, but we found this idea of moving to a regenerative and just mindset really triggering for a lot of folks. I will say myself as well. There's a lot of things that I've done my whole life that that you think, well, isn't this right? Like, isn't this good as well? So we had a lot of folks that really were triggered by it. One person in particular from one of the big companies that we worked with was very difficult throughout the process. And he kept, he really kind of was grappling with this. And then he said to us afterwards, I kind of realized that some of my feedback was spot on, and some of it was because I was grappling with how much I believed in some of this and how much I knew it was going to be gosh darn hard to do it in my multi-billion-dollar international company. And so, yeah, I think there's something where you can, and I will say though, that's where we need to go, where the tension is, right? When people start to feel like, ooh, that's where the good work happens. So quite controversial in some ways, but I think that will hopefully deliver some interesting insights.
Terrific. And you also have you guys also authored the Critical Shifts Report, which is kind of the next phase, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yes, and that I know, Jacqueline, you and I went back and forth on this. That is out there, and what it's doing is providing a little bit more of those roadmaps from this department to this department, or an HR department that's focusing on a risk mitigation mindset to a regenerative mindset. So yes, that is the main tool we're hoping to be able to bring to businesses and kick the tires on.
Terrific. Is there anything else? We've got about 15 minutes left. Is there anything before segueing into Q&A? Is there anything else you wanted to touch on as it relates to those reports or the principles?
I guess the one thing I'll just say is, having worked in business and now in the nonprofit sector, I have no doubt that these will require, I don't know how this will work. So, I think there's something where we know that we need the system to shift in general. We need businesses to kind of link arms in this. And so that I know putting principles down is a lot easier than kind of doing the work. And so I just want to acknowledge that I know that that's a big part of the way forward. And so if people are feeling frustrated by, yeah, but how does this work? It's fair, but I'm excited to try to figure that out. Potential, right? Potential, not problem. So excited to figure that out, but definitely frustrating too.
Great, thank you for kind of those closing thoughts. Let's see, I don't see, I do see some comments, but I don't see direct questions. So I'll kick it off with a question.
Jacqueline, there's questions in the Q&A. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, let me back it up. So Ursula shares, I'm struggling with this best practice conversation because in my work, best practices consider place and many other ecological dynamics to define. They are not meant to be applied across the board unless they really can be, but this is part of the process of defining them and documenting them. Great point, Ursula.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an excellent point, and it sounds like Ursula, you and your organization's approach to best practices might already be taking some of this, this idea of specificity and being very mindful when you apply best practices. I also have no doubt in the next year I will develop a list of best practices, right? So I think it's not saying that all best practices are bad, but I do think there's something in questioning about how we use them, maybe, and how we assume they are always useful. And thinking through, what might be other approaches. And I think there's something about co-learning, right? So taking a community that maybe has done something and really learned and partnering them with a community to do some sort of kind of shared learning, which to me is different than some sort of codification of best practices. But yeah, Jacqueline, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ursula, I think it's a good point.
Thanks for that. All right, next is Jackie states, coming from the world of positive youth development, in particular, I'm drawn to your youth-led efforts. Your principles apply beautifully there as well. Would you be okay for me to share these with my class next semester?
Yes, I love that. And I would love to hear back on how that goes. Oh my gosh, I think it's called the Mycelium Network. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's this really cool youth-led network looking at kind of regenerative practices and using futures, young-led futures that I just came across recently, and I'm like totally fascinated by them. We are trying to build out future practices that are including more youth voices. Voices aren't typically heard, including youth. So yes, please do, and tell us what does and doesn't work with youth. I should try it out with my teenagers. I'm sure they will tell me all the things that don't work about this work.
Lane asks, Samantha, who are the other thought leaders on just and regenerative leadership that have available thought leadership and or case studies that we can learn from in order to deepen and expand our understanding of this topic and how to apply it with gusto?
Love it. Jacqueline, maybe after this, we can send out some more resources. I think some of the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head are the Regenesis Institute, Regenesis Group. Carol Sanford has done a lot with business, and I'm sure if Carol was here today, she'd have so much to say and correct me on some of my thinking. She's really one of the deepest practitioners of this work. I think Adrienne Maree Brown, who wrote Emergent Strategy, not quite just in regenerative, but it is really an interesting approach to change making. And the final thing, that this is not exactly about just regenerative, but I think it's a wonderful approach about a wonderful perspective on indigenous approaches to ways of knowing, is if you have not read Braiding Sweetgrass, it's this beautiful book. It's a wonderful by Rob, I'm forgetting her name, but Braiding Sweetgrass. Those are off the top of my head, but we could provide a much more thorough list for you all. Yes, Robin Wall Kimmerers. Oh, Joanna Macy, yes. I'm detecting a book club coming out of this.
Next up in April. All right, another question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, many leaders inherit a ready workforce, and some of these employees bring their histories of trauma, shame, and blame values into the job. How to transform that workplace into a safe place?
I love the question. I have no idea. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think there's something about all of us as leaders trying to figure out how do we show up in a way that, and we talk about this at Forum, less about safe space and more about brave spaces, right? So safety is important, but there's also, some of us need to be brave, to be vulnerable, to be able to show up with our whole selves. But I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that today, but I love the question. I would love to explore it.
Great. And Ursula just responded regarding best practices, that they are living practices, not stuck in time. Good point.
Yes.
And Jackie loves your whiskey option. It's certainly appealing, or coffee, and she would love to chat with you, and provided her email. So
great.
Yes. So lots of good connections being made as we speak. If there's any other questions, please put them in the chat. Samantha, I'd love to learn just what would be the one takeaway you hope that today's audience comes away with from our conversation?
I guess it would be that I think sometimes we throw around this term mindset, and the more that I do this work, the more that I think that this isn't all about scale, and it's about if we can figure out how to get each person out there to experience the need to change their mindset, and then do the work to actually change that mindset. And so I guess there's something here about having folks on this call, maybe not some huge initiative back at their organization, but begin to kind of explore what does it mean to have a regenerative and just mindset, and how do you begin applying that, not just on programs, but the way you show up with your partner, the way that how do you show up with your partner in a way that it creates a space where they have their potential to thrive? How do you do that with an employee? How do you do that with a coffee community? I don't know. So I think there's something about kind of exploring a little bit of this, looking in the mirror and figuring out. And I guess the other thing is maybe being bold and challenging some of the stuff that we've always been told is just the way that it is. This is just the way business is. This is just the way the economy is. This is just the way. So doing a little kind of self-reflection on your own mindset, and then maybe being a little bolder and challenging some of these things that I think as kids we probably knew weren't quite right, and then we were told over the years that that's just the way it is. And I would like us all to be a little more outraged.
It reminds me of a Rumi quote. It goes something to the effect of like, I wanted to change the world, and then I got clever and decided to change my mindset. And that you have to start with your own agency, your own self-efficacy, and changing the mindset, and before you're able to be effective at changing the world. So that really resonates. Just reading the chat, there's great people out there working to change corporate culture through story, and David Hutchins is one of those. David Hutchins just happens to be our guest speaker next month. We're doing a great lead-in. We are working with David doing a workshop that will be in person, and there'll be a link for that if you would like to sign up. But there's a story canvas, and that workshop will all be about how do you chart out a story through the story canvas, kind of like the business canvas, but crafting stories that evoke action and change among your listeners. And so, yeah, that is very, very, very timely. So thanks for that.
I love that. That's great. Yeah, I will try to attend. I think stories probably change more minds than good business cases do. So
yeah, you gotta.
No offense to the business cases. Again, I've developed my fair share, but whoo, God, we love them.
Leading with the heart, hand, and head. Well, I'll end with just one, ending on a high note, because we just have a couple minutes. What gives you hope right now in your work, and the work that you have laid out for you guys this year? No pressure.
Yeah, I guess the thing that gives me hope, or maybe it's more kind of what restores me, and is I am not someone who has ever been a traditionally creative soul, and I think that as we're continually confronted with really troubling headlines, and many of us probably in our work, there's something about the restorative potential of art, so I recognize I'm a total, I've been listening to poetry podcasts and just hearing kind of how people are trying to make sense of the world through art, which again, I feel like every time I show up, I'm a kid and I don't know what I'm doing because I'm really not creative. But anyway, there's something where I find trying to balance a lot of the intellectual work that I do and a lot of the data that is asked for with a awesome poem about Minnesota. I just listened to this great poem about Minnesota recently. That is restorative to me. So, and the people who think like that and can bring that creative energy to the challenges in front of us give me hope, because I know I'm not one of them, but I know that I'm lucky enough to share this space, this world with them. So that's what gives me hope. If you have another great resource, For the Wild podcast. For the Wild podcast is great. It brings some of this thinking to various topics.
Terrific. I wrote those all down. Samantha, thank you so much just for your generosity of spirit and your insight and your revelations today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I wrote these down. So we will be sharing all these links and resources in a follow-up email. And it sounds like you'll be an inspiration for our next semester of youth, which is really exciting. And all those that are tuning in, we hope you tune in next month for the Story Canvas workshop that will be in person. And there is a link in the chat for that. So I hope everybody has a terrific day, and we'll see you next month.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thanks, Samantha.